So springs are fun, but they can be quite tricky to use. Most of my machines have got springs in somewhere, so this video is about how I've managed to use them. I'm not a spring expert, but I have been using them for a long time. If you want to skip to a particular chapter, here are the contents. So, basics. Some materials are springy, and more springy than others, or more elastic. So this is a little strip of lead. Even this is a little bit springy, but if you put any force on it, it just flops over. Lead does not make a good spring. Aluminium, that's a little bit better, but that's already starting to bend. Not really much better. This is a bit of laminate. That's a bit better, but not really very good. It's brittle. That's another thing that can happen to materials. Wood. Well, wood varies. This is chipboard. A little bit of bend there, but really not very. Again, too brittle, really. This is just a bit of ordinary wood, but it's got a knot in halfway up, so I don't quite know what this will do. I haven't practiced this. Oh, it's not bad actually. Yes, it broke on the knot. So for wood to be any good as a spring, it has to be fairly straight grained. So this bit is, and that's pretty good. So if you imagine it like the bottom of beds, they're very often just wooden slats, and have a sort of comfortable springiness to them. So, and of course old-fashioned longbows were just were wooden too. Then there's rubber, very springy material. I like this bungee cord stuff. If you look inside, it's just little strips of natural rubber with this woven casing. I like it for prototypes. It's very quick to use to get a feel of what sort of force you need. But at least with natural rubber, it's not really good for permanent things because it perishes. This old catapult, you can see it starting to perish on the ends. But really today most springs are made of steel. Well, this is just a bit of mild steel, and yes, it looks springy, but it's not really that much better than the aluminium. It's very easily just deforms permanently, called plastic deformation. But spring steel made for springs, is a sort of alloy. There's a little bit of carbon and quite often a bit of manganese added as well. So this is spring steel. And it does go back to almost exactly where it started from. So the simplest springs are just strips of material, usually spring steel. And of course springs like this are quite widely used in locks, but also the leaf springs in cars. There's generally sort of 3 of them, which I think makes them get progressively harder as they're more loaded. Though actually my transit van just has a single leaf on the back wheels, just like this. But I think the classic spring, what people generally think of as a spring, is the coil spring. And these coil springs, expansion springs, are the springs that I use much more often than any other sort. They're very easy to make really. You start off with some spring steel wire, which I can make into a spring on my lathe. And now I've just got to form the ends. Try and do this one a bit more neatly. Not the neatest ends, but probably would do. Of course, the Chinese now have a much more sophisticated way of making springs. So I've got a nice big spring here, and unstretched it's about 250 millimeters long, 9.5 inches imperial sort of thing. So now I've attached a 15 kilogram weight to it, to the spring. I'm going to see if I can get it over the hook. There we go. And now the length of the spring is about 330. Another one of these monstrous 15 kilo Whoa, that was a bit of a struggle. So now we've got two of those weights, and the elongation is, so it's now 420. So the elongation is just about twice as much. So basically you've got twice the load and twice the extension. And this is a kind of a basic rule about springs, often called Hooke's law after the scientist Robert Hooke, that the elongation is proportional to the load. And of course this is how spring balances work. So if I just pull the hand off that, take the dial off so you can see inside, now I should be able to put the pointer back. So if I pull now, you can see the teeth there, and if I turn this up at an angle, you can see in here there's a little gear, there's a white gear in there, and you can see how that rotates as the pulling the teeth. And of course spring balances come in all shapes and sizes. Pirate practice actually weighs people. Right down in the bottom here, there's a linear actuator and two powerful springs. So when you get on the machine, sitting on the seat, the linear actuator starts moving and stretching the spring until it gets to a point where it's balancing my weight. So then my seat starts to lift up, and when it gets to about halfway, it reaches a sensor which tells the linear actuator to stop. So the stretch of the spring is proportional to my weight. And the brilliant thing about this is that it enables people of completely different weights to race evenly with each other. So another basic property of springs is that they have a sort of natural resonant frequency. So if I just tap this at the right sort of moment, a bit like pushing a kid on a swing, you can build up quite an amplitude, which is quite something with these really heavy weights with very little effort. It's a sort of resonant frequency, and this varies with the weight. So if I take one of these weights off, this is a moment swinging, it's about 1.5 seconds. And if I try and take one of these off, and do it again, it's much more rapid. It's about once a second now. So it's this natural frequency of springs and weights that pocket watches and wristwatches use, mechanical ones, to keep time. So this particular one, this is a rather beautiful Waltham pocket watch from about 1906. Waltham were the first company to mass produce pocket watches by machine tools, and I think they're particularly beautiful. Anyway, inside, that's the balance wheel whizzing backwards and forwards there, and you can just see the hairspring in there, black, whizzing backwards and forwards too. Underneath is the escape wheel, and it's this combination of the weight of the balance wheel and the spring that has this natural frequency that makes the watch keep time. While this stuff about natural frequencies is fun, it is a bit academic generally for my uses.
Oh, yum, yum. That smells good.
So inside the machine there's this drum that has the two scenes and the starting scene. And the motor is down the bottom here, connected originally by a chain drive, this sprocket here with another sprocket on the bottom. But I couldn't get it to stop in exactly the right position. So I added this wheel on the end of this motor, this rubber wheel, and a spring to push it up against the outside of the drum. So it's a sort of friction drive now. And this stops really, really precisely. Choosing a spring, not always easy to choose the right spring. I mean, I've got quite a box of old springs, so I usually just pick one and see what happens. I'm going to use this to try and balance the weight on this arm with a spring as an example. So to balance this weight, I would just sort of get a feel of how much force I need, and then try and find a spring that was suitable. This one's had it a bit. But of course you can use catalogues. There are a lot of very detailed spring catalogues, but they aren't half confusing. I mean, I do use them, and I spend quite a long time poring over them when I do, but even so I quite often get the wrong spring. And a friend of mine always buys three, one too stiff and one too weak, and hopes that one of the three will be about right. And of course, for any mechanism you can what the force is just with a spring balance. So in this case, yeah, it's about 2.5 kilograms force is what I'm looking for. But I don't usually buy springs from spring catalogues. I just occasionally buy this box of 12-inch continuous length assorted springs. And it's a wonderfully good value. It's about 40 quid and you get lots and lots of springs. And they vary widely in how strong they are. So then you can just sort of play with them and decide, that one feels too stiff, that one feels really stiff, that was definitely not going to be any good. So then you have to decide the length of the spring. A short length always feels a lot stiffer than the whole thing. The spring rate or force as needed to make it extend for every millimetre is greater for a short length than a long length. In relation to this example, the advantage of a long spring is that it'll be balanced over a much bigger range than a short spring. If I just hold it there firmly, because the force in the spring's varying by a bigger percentage over this range. So for this example, I'll obviously need something a bit longer than that, maybe about that long. I should also say that with springs of the same sort of wire size, that fat diameter ones will stretch much more easily than tight narrow ones, and also these baggy ones you can stretch to twice their initial length, whereas the tight ones you can usually only stretch to about 1.5 times their length. And anyway, I sort of plump for a spring out of my spring box, and then I have to form the ends to make a loop. So the way I do that, I do it in the vise with a pair of electrical pliers. I just squash the pliers around the end loop of wire to try and force it away from the main body of the spring a bit, like that. I then try and catch this loop, this separated loop, in the vise, in the corner of the vise, and then get my pliers out. That should be quite easy to get. So there's my loop. Sometimes you need to cut these lengths of spring, and you can use a little Dremel with a grinding disc. They're hard steel, so you can't cut it with a hacksaw. I've got a Proxon long neck angle grinder, which I particularly like. And I should say, you have to be careful not to cut into any of the windings that you want to keep, because this is hard steel. Even the slightest nick can form a weakness which may snap later. You don't usually have to go all the way through. Yeah, that's going to break now. And then of course you need to form the other end in exactly the same way as I formed the first one. So now you have your spring with the two ends. And then, of course, you've got to fix the bottom end of the spring. And I quite often try to make the bottom end adjustable so that you get exactly what you want to balance it. That's not bad. And that'll sort of reasonably balance it over quite a range. I quite often do balance mechanisms to make a lighter load for the motor, or to make it move more easily for one reason or another.
Mum, you're in the middle.
I'm in the middle, am I?
I'm a bit freaked. Shut the doors.
It appears to be attacking our craft. As we marvel at the peristalsis of the fish's gullet, beware. The gastric juices are highly caustic and are even now eating through our protective shell.
It's easy to get a spring a bit wrong. When my bathyscape underwater adventure machine starts leaking, people grab the reverse thrusters lever incredibly hard. It's just a simple thing. There's the spring, but it snapped several times. I think the fatal flaw was that the nut on the end tightened up, clamping the end of the spring, and this creates a stress point, which is where it snaps. I should have known better. The ends of a spring must always be free to move about.
Freshly regurgitated, and thankful to still be alive.
Yes, we're out.
But there is an alternative in many situations for balancing a load, which is to use, rather than a spring, not to use a spring at all, but to use a counterweight instead. So I prepared this counterweight, which I'll just screw on here. Am I going in? Yeah. And the great advantage of counterweight, it's just sort of balanced wherever you put it. So it then balances an arm anywhere. This clock I made for London Zoo has a mix of counterweights and springs to balance the various mechanisms. This bird box has a counterweight, and so does the bird cage at the front. There wasn't a good place to put counterweights for the toucans, so they're balanced by two long springs. So the advantage of the counterweight is that there's nothing to go wrong. These springs, they have to be stainless because it's outdoors, and in the cold, when it's really cold, one of them cracked. Had to replace it. I never completely trust stainless springs. I think there's a compromise. To make the metal stainless, it's no longer quite so ideal. Its springy characteristics, so you can't stress them so much as an ordinary spring. So another sort of common spring is a compression spring. I don't use these a lot. They're very easy to make. You don't need to buy them really, because you can just get an ordinary spring, put it in the vise and stretch it really hard, and it won't go back to where it started. But the problem I find with them is that once they get sort of long and thin, when you start compressing them, they want to buckle. They don't want to just squash in squarely. A lot of compression springs are just sort of short, fat, squidgy ones, because they're much less likely to buckle. If you do want to use a long one, you need to put a rod down the middle. This is an enormous industrial spring, but you can see there's a rod that goes down the middle with an outer sleeve that it goes into there. This sort of spring, it's a bit like the spring on the car boots, but they tend to use these gas springs, and gas springs are extraordinary because they're so tiny, but the force is I can't squish it up at all. They're full of highly compressed gas, but yeah, much more compact than a physical spring at the same force. Well, another variety of compression spring is what's called a variable rate spring. So they're like these battery terminals. You can see the shape of the spring is sort of conical, and if you let's get this right, when you start to squish them up, it's the middle turns that go first. They squish before the outer ones, and that's why it's called a variable rate spring. So a spring like this won't obey Hooke's law anymore. Ingenious idea. Of course, bed springs are exactly like that. Well, another sort of spring that avoids distorting and buckling is a rather pretty spring called a volute spring. You sometimes get these in secateurs. Where is it? There's the volute spring in there. So another sort of spring is a clock spring or a torsion spring, and these are actually very common. So just ordinary things like a safety pin is really just a torsion spring, and also a clothes peg. It's got a little spring in the inside there, keeping it closed. But again, like compression springs, I don't use these very often in my machines, very rarely in fact. But I think the main reason is they're harder to adjust. So an extension spring, you can adjust the end stop and do so much with. These again are more fiddly for one-off machines, I think. But they are beautiful things. This is also from a clock. Made from spring steel. This is actually the chime from a clock. Spring steel resonates wonderfully, so lovely deep note. And I should have actually said that a lot of springs, particularly compression springs, make a nice noise. Or a different one. The other contraption that uses springs like this are old record players, the old wind-up ones, clockwork ones that played the old 78 RPM records. This is the mechanism of one, and inside this barrel here is one humongous spring, and when they get to be this big they usually totally enclose the springs because they can be quite dangerous if they just spring out unexpectedly. I'll just try and wind this up a bit. So that's wound now. I'll zoom in a bit on it. So the this would be underneath the record player, and that would be the pivot of the turntable under there. So if I now release the brake, it'll start to go. But they have to have a governor in to keep them going at a constant speed, which is rather a beautiful mechanism in here. Whoops. And that's the speed regulator, is the little knob down here, little lever. Oops. Of course, clocks have a similar problem. Clock springs provide much more force when they're fully wound than when they're nearly unwound. So one traditional, rather beautiful way of coping with this problem, it's the right way around to see it, is this beautiful thing in here called a fusee. It's a spiral wound groove with a gear on the end. So that's the spring barrel in there, and it's connected by steel cable to the fusee. It's fully wound at the moment, so it's wrapped around comes off the smallest part of the fusee. But as the clock spring unwinds, more and more of the cable wraps around the spring drum, and eventually it'll be coming off the other end of the fusee, much bigger diameter. And this has the effect of providing an almost perfectly constant force to the clock escapement. So another sort of spring is constant force springs. So things like this tool balancer will be stable wherever I put it. The spring rate remains the same in any position. So what's going on inside here? It's actually just got a long spring like this, and seat belts mechanisms are a bit the same. It's just a tightly wrapped coil of spring steel strip that unwinds like that. Well, you might think this looks exactly the same as a clock spring, but as a clock spring unwinds, every different part of the spring is changing its radius. Every bit of the whole spring is contributing to the springiness, if you like, of the whole thing. Whereas in these ones, it's so tightly wrapped that this is kind of fixed. So when you stretch it out, the only bit that's actually changing at any time is this short section between where it's curved and where it's straight. Once it's straight, it's staying the same, so it's not contributing any force. So it doesn't matter how far you stretch it, it's still this little section here that is what's providing the retracting force, and that's why it remains constant. Oh, and one last thing about the constant force spring. You might think it's the same as in a tape measure, and in many ways it's very similar, but the tape measure just stays effortlessly straight. It's a very clever thing. And so this is a very special sort of spring. It's called a negator spring, not to be confused with a constant force spring. So this is another sort of spring I like very much. This is a springy washer called a Belleville washer. If you look carefully, you can see they're just very slightly dished. It's not obvious how these washers could be a spring, but if you push them together hard, they gradually get flatter. So one way of thinking about them is that they are an extra small compression spring. They're just doing that when you compress them. So I use these Belleville washers as torque limiters. So this is a torque limiter on this chain drive. According to how tightly I tighten up the nut, limits the torque. So there it's quite slack. If I tighten the nut up a bit more, so now I can just about push the thing along the table. If I tighten it up a lot more, I'll have to put my hand on it this time to stop. I can still just about stop it. So it's very finely adjustable. So what's inside, behind the nut, there's this lock washer to fix the nut in a particular place. Then here are the two Belleville washers, slightly dished. Then there's the pulley, and the pulley is sandwiched between these two fibre washers, like that. So what it's doing is the more I tighten up the nut, the more it's pushing the fibre washers against the pulley, and that's how it controls the torque. But you can make your own, a more simple-minded version. So I make up something like this, which fixes onto my motor. Then you put a washer over the end, then your load, in this case a V-pulley, another one of those. Then you put your 2 Belleville washers, then a flat washer, and finally a nut. And again, the same sort of thing, it turns quite easily now, but now it's sort of started to get quite stiff to turn. So I often use torque limiters with chain drives for any mechanism that's exposed to the public, so that they can't get their fingers stuck, or can't hurt their fingers if they do get them stuck in a mechanism, but also if the mechanism itself can get jammed. So this is part of a clock I made for the Exploratorium in San Francisco. There are 8 mechanisms on each side, and if any one of them gets jammed, the motor and everything else will still keep running, because they've all got these torque limiters. Springs are often used in conjunction with shock absorbers. In cars, the combination gives a much better ride. With just a spring, you'd be bouncing up and down like crazy. You can buy smaller shock absorbers. I have to admit, I've never really got into using them much. They're expensive and never quite got a feel of what size you need for what load. But they are good. So on this model here, I've just connected this lever arm with a spring, and initially it's just going to land on a steel stop. You wouldn't want to have your finger in there, but it's a big shock load for the mechanism. So if I replace the steel stop now with a shock absorber, there'll be a big difference. So now, repeat the experiment. It's just beautiful the way it sort of brings it up to a controlled stop. Oh, and door closers are a good sort of budget form of shock absorber. I've never actually used one on my machines, but I just feel they have a lot of potential. Well, the other reason I don't often use these shock absorbers is because there's a much more simple-minded, cheaper option, which is just these little rubber conical buffers, if you like, stops. So I'll now replace the shock absorber with this stop. So now repeating the experiment with the conical rubber stop. It's not so graceful, but it does the job. It still brings the things to a stop with a lot less shock. In the Pirate, there's an awful lot of energy in these springs, and particularly when you get really heavy people using it. So anyway, it needs serious spring stops. I've got 2 of my rubber cones in there, and that stops at the top, and an even bigger one for stopping when people bounce down round the back. Well, that's the end of this video. I hope you found something interesting or useful in it. I'm going to leave you with Divorce, another machine of mine that contains lots of springs and dampers.